Hey friends, tonight we're going to ancient Rome, not to talk about emperors or conquests or marble statues, but about snacks. The grab it off the counter, eat it with your hands kind. The burnt at the edges, slightly sour, fish sauce drenched kind. The kind that left your fingers greasy and your stomach full enough to get through the next shift of hauling bricks or arguing with your in-laws. Because even in a world without vending machines or food courts or drive-thrus, people still crave the same thing, something hot, salty and slightly regrettable. So before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe. But only if this kind of sleepy, snack-filled history actually helps you wind down. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's oddly comforting to know who else is nodding off to the sound of deep-fried Roman street food. Now dim the lights. Maybe imagine the smell of olive oil, garlic and just a little bit of fermented fish sauce drifting through a crowded street. Let's ease into it. Because tonight's story doesn't start in the Colosseum or the Senate. It starts in a noisy alley behind a bathhouse, where someone's trying to sell you something suspicious and vaguely delicious for a few bronze coins. Rome wasn't big on home cooking, at least not for the average person. Your apartment probably didn't have a kitchen, maybe a brazier, maybe a fire if the landlord wasn't too strict about the rules. But more often than not, you ate outside, on the street, from a stall. Enter the thermopolium, Rome's version of the fast food counter. They were everywhere. Wooden brick stalls with big stone counters, holes in the top where hot pots sat steaming with beans, stews, or gloppy porridge that hadn't been stirred in far too long. You didn't get a menu. You pointed, maybe sniffed, handed over a coin if you had one, and hoped what you got wasn't yesterday's leftovers reheated with more oil. It was crowded, it was loud, there were flies. Someone was probably shouting in Latin about bad fish or spilled wine. And still, you waited in line. Because the food was cheap, and it was hot, and it was better than the stale bread you had at home. You'd stand there in your tunic, maybe sweating from the bathhouse, maybe hungover from the tavern, and eat something handheld and mysterious. Maybe it was chickpea fritters. Maybe it was fish wrapped in vine leaves. Maybe it was whatever they scraped off the grill and promised was pork. You didn't ask, you just ate. Because junk food, even 2,000 years ago, had one goal: to be fast, salty, and just satisfying enough to make you forget that the rent was due, the public latrines were full, and your cousin owed you 3 denarii he was never going to pay back. You didn't come to the thermopolium for variety. You came for something that would keep your stomach quiet for a few hours. Something you could eat with one hand while arguing with your neighbour or leaning on a sun-warmed column. And more often than not, that meant bread, beans, or something vaguely fried. The bread was never fresh. It wasn't soft. It wasn't crusty in a satisfying way. It was flat, dense, dry. Sometimes flavoured with garlic, onions, or herbs, if the vendor was feeling generous, or trying to cover up the fact that it had been sitting out since yesterday. You'd dip it in vinegar, or oil, or, if you had a little coin, garum, the infamous Roman fish sauce. It didn't make the bread better, but it made it softer, and that was something. Then there were the beans. Broad beans, lentils, chickpeas, soaked, boiled, smashed. Sometimes left to sit overnight so they could soak up more oil and flavour, or just more of the countertop they'd been cooling on. They weren't seasoned delicately, they were salted, heavily, because salt preserved things, and also because Romans believed heavily salted food made you drink more, which conveniently increased wine sales. Next to the beans you might see fritters, little deep-fried blobs made from chickpea flour, garlic, herbs, and whatever scraps of vegetable were lying around. Crispy at the edges, soggy in the middle, burnt if you showed up late. even if you didn't show up early enough. That they weren't good, but they were hot. And when you're tired and sweating and 2 hours from your next wage, hot counts for a lot. Sometimes vendors sold polenta, a kind of boiled cornmeal mash, thick enough to hold its shape if it cooled too long, which it often did. You could buy a square of it, cut with a dull knife and handed to you on a scrap of fig leaf or yesterday's bill. You'd eat it fast, because the flies were fast, and because someone was waiting behind you to grab the last fritter. This wasn't a meal, this was fuel. You didn't savour it, you survived it. And honestly, you didn't mind, because tomorrow you'd be back. Same street, same stall, same cart full of things that maybe started life as vegetables, maybe as animals, and now just tasted like Rome. Salty, oily, and impossible to fully identify. And that was good enough. If the beans were basic and the bread was dry, there were still moments, rare, slightly greasy moments, when Roman street food crossed the line into something closer to indulgence. Not luxurious, not refined, but indulgent in that specific way cheap food can be when it's hot, salty, and just weird enough to feel like a treat. Let's start with fried cheese. Yes, the Romans had it. Little lumps of fresh cheese. Salty, soft, sometimes still warm from the kitchen, tossed in flour, dipped in oil, and fried until the edges bubbled. They didn't melt like modern cheese. They didn't stretch or ooze. They squeaked a little when you bit into them, but they were golden, hot, and fatty, which is all you really want after a long day in the market. Sometimes, if you were lucky, they were sprinkled with herbs or drizzled with honey. Just enough sweetness to distract you from the oil. Just enough warmth to remind you life wasn't entirely terrible. Then came the pork patties. They weren't burgers, not really. They were more like ground pork mixed with spices, herbs and breadcrumbs, mashed together into a rough circle and grilled over open coals. You'd eat them wrapped in bread, or by hand, or skewered on a stick if the vendor had time. No sauce, no lettuce, no cheese. Just hot meat, maybe dipped in garum. Juicy, salty and slightly mysterious. You didn't ask what part of the pig it came from. You didn't want to know. You just ate it before it cooled and turned back into whatever it was before. And then there were the dormice. Yes, dormice. Small, soft rodents. Technically a delicacy. Something the upper classes like to fatten in little clay pots and serve stuffed with herbs and pine nuts. But they made it to the streets too. Roasted on skewers. Dusted with pepper. Served whole. Fur off. Bones still in. You'd bite in, crunch a little, and pretend not to care. It was protein, it was hot, it was available, and that was enough. Because if Roman food had one rule, it was this. If it can be cooked in oil, it will be. If it fits on a stick, even better. If it's questionable, fry it longer. And if it tastes strange, drown it in garum and pretend it's exotic. So you'd eat your cheese, and your pork, and your rodent maybe, and chase it down with warm wine from a chipped cup and keep walking. Not full, not clean, but fed. Just enough to get through the next task, the next errand, the next argument about land rights or goat theft or unpaid debt. Because Roman junk food wasn't about joy, it was about getting through the day, and occasionally it was about forgetting that most of your life was dry bread and cheap vinegar, and this little fried thing, whatever it was, might be the best part of your week. If there's one ingredient that shows up everywhere in Roman food, rich or poor, street stall or villa, it's garum. And if you've never smelled it, you're lucky. Because garum wasn't subtle. It was fermented fish sauce, and not the polite kind. It was made by layering small fish, anchovies, mackerel, sardines, in big clay vats, heads, guts, bones, the works. Then they'd cover it in salt, leave it in the sun, and wait. Weeks, sometimes months. The fish broke down slowly. The heat helped. The salt kept it from turning into full-blown rot. What rose to the top was a dark, oily liquid, pungent, briny, smelling somewhere between low tide and old feet. That was garum. It was skimmed off, bottled and sold across the empire, in amphorae sealed with wax, stamped with the maker's name, because yes, garum had brands. It was expensive. At least the good stuff was. High-end garum was filtered, aged, and sometimes mixed with herbs or wine. But there was also the cheap stuff. Leftovers, sludge. Thick, salty paste scraped from the bottom of the vat, sold by the ladle in alleys, poured into reused jars. That's what you'd get with your street food. And Romans put it on everything. Beans, add garum. Bread, dip it in garum. Meat, marinate it in garum. Fruit, sprinkle it with garum. To Roman taste buds, it wasn't weird. It was flavour, salt, umami, a hit of sour, like ketchup. If ketchup had bones in it, they didn't just cook with it. They drank it sometimes, used it as medicine, rubbed it on wounds. Some thought it warded off illness, others just liked the smell, which is debatable. But to a Roman, garum was civilization in a bottle. It turned bland grain mush into dinner. It covered the flavour of meat that was a little too old. It added punch to lentils, to eggs, to fish, even to desserts. Yes, some honey-sweetened dishes included a few drops of garum. It wasn't just a condiment, it was a way of life. You could find garum factories near every Roman port. Huge vats, flies swarming, the smell drifting for miles. People hated living near them, but they couldn't live without what they made. And if you couldn't afford the good stuff, you bought the cheap stuff and pretended. And if you couldn't afford that, you scraped the inside of someone else's jar. Because Roman food at its core was salt and fish, not always fresh, rarely clean, but always there. Garum didn't make food good, it made it possible. And in a city where most people were one bad harvest away from hunger, that was enough. Garum touched everything. Not just fish, not just stews, everything. Because once you get used to it, once your brain accepts that salty, sour, fermented tang, it becomes hard to eat without it. And Romans didn't just accept it, they craved it. Let's start simple. Eggs. Boiled, soft, or mashed into a kind of proto-deviled egg filling. They weren't served with salt, pepper, or herbs. They were served with garum, poured directly on top, not a drizzle, not a hint. A full ladle if you could afford it. Then there was meat, especially pork. Boiled, grilled, roasted, didn't matter. It was marinated in garum, basted in garum. Sometimes boiled in garum with dates and honey until it turned into something between dinner and dessert. It shouldn't have worked, but apparently it did. Because the Romans didn't separate flavours the way we do. They liked sweet with salty, fishy with fruity, vinegar with everything. Garum was the glue that made it all come together. Bread? Yes. Dip it in garum, or mix it into the dough for extra savoury depth. Vegetables? Absolutely. Boiled cabbage, lentils, chickpeas, turnips. No one wanted to eat those plain. Garum made them taste like something. Even fruit wasn't safer. There are recipes, actual Roman recipes, that call for figs stuffed with walnuts and garum, or dates stewed in garum and wine. By modern standards, it's confusing. By Roman standards, it was normal. If it came to the table, it got garum. Even wine had its variations, sometimes mixed with seawater, sometimes with spices, sometimes, yes, with a splash of garum, for flavour, or maybe just to prove you could stomach it. You start to realise garum wasn't a flavour anymore, it was an expectation. If your stew didn't taste right, add garum. If your beans were bland, garum. If your husband came home grumpy, garum. No joke. Some Roman writers mentioned serving garum as a sort of marital peace offering. It was that central. And even when it wasn't poured directly on the food, you could taste it. Because the pot had been used before. The ladle hadn't been cleaned. The air smelled like garum from the stall next door. You couldn't avoid it. Didn't want to. It was like a Roman umami fog settling over everything. Comforting. Salty. Fermented. A reminder that you were in the middle of the empire. And this was how the empire ate. Not like emperors. Not like gladiators. Like people. Tired, hungry, reaching for the one thing that always made things taste a little better, even if it started as rotten fish in a jar. Now that you've eaten your deep-fried cheese, your vinegared beans, and your fish sauce-drenched bread, you need something to wash it down. But don't ask for water, not unless you want to gamble with your stomach lining. Because Roman water, especially in cities, was rarely safe. Even with their famous aqueducts, the urban supply picked up all sorts of things along the way. Runoff, animal waste, whatever was upstream, and whatever you pulled from a cistern or well might have been sitting there too long. So most Romans drank something else. Diluted wine, sour wine, spiced wine, boiled wine, vinegar water, herbal infusions, almost anything except just plain water. If you were poor or a soldier, you drank posca. Posca was a mix of sour wine and water, sometimes with herbs or a splash of vinegar. Not refreshing, not luxurious, but safe. Sort of. It was mildly antiseptic. Enough alcohol to kill the worst germs. Enough sourness to keep your mouth puckered and your expectations low. It was portable. It was cheap. It was everywhere. Soldiers drank it with every meal. Labourers carried it in clay jars. Even the better taverns kept it around, for those who couldn't afford the good stuff. Then there was actual wine. But don't imagine Bordeaux or Merlot. Roman wine was often sweet, spiced, smoky, thick, or borderline spoiled. It came in huge amphorae, sealed with pitch or resin or wax. Sometimes they added lead to improve the flavour. Yes, lead. That may explain a lot about the empire, honestly. You didn't drink it straight. That was considered barbaric. Romans always diluted their wine with water, cold if possible, warm if necessary, snow if you were rich. The strength of the mix said something about you. Too strong and you were a drunk. Too weak and you were cheap. There were flavoured wines too, infused with herbs, honey, myrrh, saffron, even seawater. Some were cooked into a syrup before serving. Thick, sticky, sweet enough to coat your teeth. They didn't just drink to get drunk. Wine was part of everything. You started the day with it. You drank it with lunch. You cooked with it. You offered it to the gods. You poured it for guests. You splashed it in stew when the garum ran out. Even kids drank it, watered down, but wine all the same. Because wine wasn't about taste, it was about safety and habit, and the strange comfort of drinking something that couldn't hurt you more than your food already had. And if you were rich, there were better vintages, imported bottles, fancy cups. But the man at the Thermopolium? He drank what everyone else drank. From a clay cup, sticky at the rim, passed back to the vendor after the last gulp. Sour, warm. Probably older than it should be, but still better than the water. After all the vinegar and salt and fish sauce, you might think dessert didn't stand a chance in ancient Rome, but it did. Not cake and cookies exactly, but sweet things, sticky things, things soaked in honey until your fingers stayed tacky for the rest of the afternoon. Because despite their reputation for stern discipline and stone architecture, Romans had a serious sweet tooth. It just looked a little different. Let's start with honey cakes. They weren't fluffy, they weren't light, They were dense, almost chewy, made with flour, eggs, and enough honey to count as both dessert and glue. Sometimes they were flavoured with spices, pepper even, because Roman desserts didn't always lean into sweetness. They liked contrast, savoury and sweet, hot and cold, honey and vinegar in the same bite. You'd buy a little honey cake wrapped in a leaf or pressed into a small clay dish. It might be warm, it might not. It might taste like the pan it was cooked in. But it was sweet, and that was rare enough to matter. Then there were the fried dough treats, proto-donuts in a way. Simple batter, sometimes made with cheese, sometimes just flour and oil, fried until golden, then dunked in honey or a spiced syrup that smelled like cloves and fennel. You ate them quickly, before they cooled, before the bees noticed, before your friend asked for one. If you had a few extra coins, you might get figs stuffed with nuts, split open, filled with crushed almonds or walnuts, sometimes dipped in wine and left to soften. Or maybe dates, even better. Boiled with wine, rolled in pepper, filled with pine nuts and served warm. It sounds strange, because it is. But Romans liked their sweets complex, almost confusing. They didn't separate dessert from the rest of the meal, they just added sweetness wherever they could. A drizzle of honey over cheese, a splash of syrup in a stew, a slice of fruit dipped in salt and vinegar and called a treat. There was no sugar, not yet. So honey did all the work. Beekeeping was serious business. Hives were kept in rows, clay or wood or even stone, and vendors guarded their jars like gold. Because a bit of honey at the end of a meal wasn't just indulgent. It was a moment. Something to make you forget that the rest of your day had been olives and flatbread and fermented fish. Something sweet enough to remind you that life wasn't just salt and smoke. Even if it only lasted 3 bites. You didn't eat Roman street food at home. You couldn't, most of the time. Your home didn't have a kitchen. Maybe a charcoal brazier if your landlord looked the other way. But if you were like most people in the city, you lived in an insula, a tall, creaky apartment block with too many people and not enough fire exits. So you ate in the street, or at a tavern. And that wasn't like stepping into a quiet pub or modern cafe. It was loud, smoky, unapologetically crowded. The tavern, called a popina, was half bar, half diner, half questionable life choice. It was where you went when you didn't have a kitchen and didn't want to eat beans on a stick in the rain. You walked in and were hit with the smell of old wine, fried oil, charcoal smoke, and too many bodies. The floor was swept, maybe. The tables were stained, definitely. The stools wobbled. The ceiling hung low with soot from 1,000 forgotten lunches. You didn't get a plate. You got a bowl, or maybe a wooden tray. You didn't get a menu. You got whatever was hot and hadn't burned yet. The owner, usually gruff, rarely sober, would grunt at you. Sometimes he knew your name. More often, he just knew how many coins you carried. There was no privacy. You sat shoulder to shoulder with workers, sailors, house slaves, out-of-town merchants, and the occasional pickpocket pretending to be a cook. Someone might be arguing. Someone else might be passed out in the corner. Someone was definitely spitting in the alley. There was almost always a cat. Not a cute one. A street survivor with one ear, watching your fish bones closely. And above all, there was graffiti, scratched into the walls, scrawled in charcoal, etched with knives. Declarations of love, insults, crude drawings, quotes from bad poets and worse politicians. It was how Romans talked when no one was listening, and especially when they were. And through it all, you ate. Hot stew in a cracked bowl, bread dipped in vinegar, wine that had been watered down twice and still tasted too strong. The food wasn't the point, the food was fuel. The point was that it was hot, that it filled the corners of your stomach, that you weren't eating alone. Because in a city as massive and chaotic as Rome, Eating in a room full of shouting strangers, broken furniture and garum fumes was about as comforting as it got. If you thought the tavern was chaotic, wait until you dealt with the staff. Roman food service was not polite, it wasn't friendly, it wasn't even particularly efficient. But it was consistent in the way that only something loud, understaffed, and vaguely sticky can be. The vendor didn't smile. He didn't ask how your day was. He didn't pretend to care. He shouted your order, maybe, or just slammed a bowl down in front of you and moved on to the next shouting voice. If you were lucky, it was your food. If you weren't, it was cold beans and someone else's half-eaten fish cake. You didn't send it back. You ate it. Because you were hungry. Because the wine was hitting. Because the table was already half occupied by a man asleep with his face in his lentils. Bowls were reused, rarely washed, maybe rinsed in a bucket out back, maybe not. Spoons were communal, if they existed at all. Fingers were faster. No one blinked if you licked yours. The counter was scorched and stained. Grease dripped from somewhere overhead. The cook had been there since dawn, sweating into a pan the size of a chariot wheel and yelling at a boy to stoke the fire. You didn't ask questions. You didn't check the date on anything. You didn't want to know. You ate what was hot. You left what wasn't. You drank the wine fast enough to forget the flavour, and it was still better than eating at home. Because at least here the food was warm, and you were surrounded by other people doing exactly the same thing, grumbling about the wait, pointing at half-burnt fritters like they were treasure, tearing stale bread in half and laughing when it crumbled, leaning on each other, arguing, breathing the same smoke, sharing the same dirty bench. It was bad service in a bad room, with food that shouldn't have worked, and somehow that made it perfect, because you didn't come for fine dining, you came for life, and maybe a nap afterward. It didn't take much to eat in Rome, not if you were willing to keep your standards low, which most people were. The average Roman didn't carry a wallet. They carried a handful of coins, tiny, greasy, half-worn, and hopefully enough to get them through the day. The smallest was the quadrans, a little bronze coin, the kind you could lose in your pocket and never notice, until it was time to eat. With one quadrans you could buy a hunk of bread, not a baguette, not a loaf, just a thick crusty slice, maybe yesterday's, maybe soaked in oil if you paid extra. You could also get a cup of posca, that sour wine and water blend that tasted like vinegar with ambition. A few quadrants might buy you a bowl of beans, or a chunk of boiled cabbage, or a scoop of barley porridge if it hadn't dried into a brick at the edge of the pot. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept your stomach from caving in. If you had a semis, half an ass, you were practically a high roller. That might get you a skewer of meat, if the meat was fresh, or a bit of stewed lentils with garum, or a cup of cheap wine served in a chipped cup with a side of warm disappointment. The truly wealthy didn't eat like this. They had kitchens, cooks, dinners that stretched for hours and ended in peacock tongues and pomegranate syrup. But for everyone else, food was priced in survival. You calculated by the coin. What could fill you up? What would keep you going until nightfall? What could you eat fast, standing before your next shift or your next errand or your next argument? And what could you afford without giving up tomorrow's coin? Because the difference between hunger and dinner was often just one quadrans. And if you dropped it, or if someone shorted your pay, or if the vendor raised the price because of a grain shortage from Egypt, that was it. You went hungry, maybe you begged, maybe you stole, maybe you just drank water and pretended. Food wasn't about pleasure, it was about math. A balancing act between appetite and pocket weight. A constant grinding calculation made by millions of people every day. And the margin was always razor thin. So what did you eat when you couldn't afford to eat? When the grain shipments were late, your boss paid you in promises and your last coin vanished in someone else's hand. You didn't fast, you foraged. You started with weeds, wild greens, dandelions, bitter herbs growing in cracks along the wall or near the aqueduct. You boiled them if you had fuel. You added vinegar if you were lucky. You chewed through bitterness and convinced yourself it was good for you. Then came scraps, old crusts tossed out by taverns, crumbs left behind in broken bowls, half-eaten figs, bruised and warm from the sun, stolen off a stall where no one was looking. Some people scraped the bottom of the oven for charcoal-dusted flour, the burnt bits left behind from yesterday's bread. They mixed it with water, formed a kind of dough, cooked it on a tile. It wasn't bread, it wasn't good, but it was warm, and it filled your stomach for an hour. Others made do with mash, a vague grey sludge made from crushed grain husks, rainwater, and whatever seasoning hadn't been locked away for the week. You ate it with a stick, or your fingers, or straight from the pot. If you had children, you gave them your portion. If you didn't, you shared with someone else's. Because poverty in Rome wasn't quiet. It was everywhere. It sat on the steps of the temples. It stood outside the bakery at dawn. It begged for scraps in the marketplace and cursed the gods when no one answered. Sometimes the poor got help. A friend, a neighbour, a free grain dole if your name was on the list. But the list was short, and the line was long, and sometimes the grain never arrived, and when that happened, people starved, not all at once, not in dramatic public scenes, but slowly, quietly, with fewer footsteps, with shallower breathing, with one less voice at the table each night. You might live through it, you might not. Either way, the city kept going. The bread sellers still shouted, the wine still flowed, the fish sauce still reeked down every alley, and you kept walking, kept chewing bark, kept pretending the ache in your stomach meant you were still alive. Because even hunger became routine, and if you were lucky, maybe tomorrow someone would give you a coin, or drop one, or forget their bread at the counter, and that would be enough for one more day. You smelled the food before you saw it, the hiss of oil, the smoke from the pan, the unmistakable smell of garlic, salt, vinegar, and sweat. But someone had to make it. And it wasn't a chef in a white coat. It wasn't an aristocrat. It wasn't anyone with clean fingernails. It was usually someone invisible, a freedman, an immigrant, a woman with a baby tied to her hip and a pot of lentils that hadn't stopped boiling since sunrise, an enslaved cook working for someone else's profit, a boy sent out to yell at passers-by while the batter bubbled behind the counter. You didn't see them unless something went wrong, unless the pot burned, unless your food was cold, unless the garum ran out, and even then you probably didn't see their face. Just a hand reaching out from behind a curtain, holding a bowl. They worked in heat, in smoke, over fires that never cooled down, with tools that bent, broke, or never existed in the first place. Knives sharpened on broken bricks, pots patched with wire, ladles made from scrap wood. They started early, sometimes before dawn, when the bread ovens were still glowing from the last night's embers. They chopped, stirred, tasted. They swatted flies with one hand and flipped dough with the other. They served hundreds of people a day and went home with just enough coin to do it again tomorrow. They didn't get rich. They didn't get famous. They didn't get recipes carved in marble. But they were everywhere, at the street corners, at the bathhouses, behind the stalls near the Colosseum, feeding the tired and the drunk and the gladiators who made it through another round. Some worked for others, some ran their own booths, some had families sleeping in the back of the shop, some had debts so deep that every bowl of stew sold was just a small temporary postponement of disaster. And still they worked, They didn't ask what you did for a living. They didn't ask your name. They just ladled another spoonful, cut another slab of bread, passed you your food without looking up. Because there were 5 more people in line behind you, and a pot about to boil over, and a day already half gone. They didn't write the recipes, they just made sure someone ate, and then they scrubbed the counter, cleaned the knives, banked the fire, and fell asleep next to the same stove they'd wake up beside the next morning. No one asked how much sleep they got. No one wondered when they last sat down, or if their hands hurt from kneading dough in the dark, or if the oil burns on their forearms ever healed. Because cooking in Rome wasn't an art, it was survival, and the people who did it were expected to be part of the background, like the smoke, or the noise, or the smell of garlic that never quite left your clothes. If you worked a thermopolium, your shift started early, before the customers, before the sun. You swept the ashes from the night before, relit the fire, stirred the stew that had been cooling in its own fat overnight. You chopped vegetables that were already starting to go soft. You rolled out dough on a board that hadn't been cleaned in a week. You tasted, adjusted. You burned your fingers and kept going. The heat never stopped. You cooked over coals and open flames, in small rooms with no ventilation. Your eyes stung. Your hair smelled like smoke. Your clothes were stiff with oil. The pots were heavy. The knives were dull. The customers were impatient. You served hundreds. You washed bowls when you had time. You reused them when you didn't. There were no breaks, no tips, no thank yous. Sometimes the boss shouted, sometimes a customer threw something. Sometimes a rat chewed through the sack of lentils you meant to serve at lunch. And still, you cooked. Because if you didn't, someone else would. There was always another freedman looking for work, another woman with 2 kids to feed, another young man from the provinces with burns on his hands and no idea how to make a decent bean mash. You couldn't afford pride, or illness, or bad days. The pot had to keep boiling, and sometimes, at the end of a shift, when the fire had died down and the smoke finally cleared, you sat by the door, ate a cold fritter you couldn't sell, and listened to the city quiet down. You weren't remembered, you weren't thanked, but for one more day, Rome ate. Because you made sure it could. Most Roman food is gone, eaten, forgotten, dissolved into history like spilled wine into dirt. But some of it stayed. In 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupted. Ash rained down on Pompeii and Herculaneum, burying everything. Buildings, people, pets, and meals. And in that moment of disaster, ordinary life was sealed in stone. Archaeologists found loaves of bread in ovens, still round, still scored. 8 even slices baked into the top, like a wheel. Blackened, yes, but unmistakably bread. You can almost smell it if you close your eyes and ignore the ash. Nearby they found food counters, rows of thermopolia, still standing. Stone counters with circular holes carved into the top. These were the serving pots. Hot food would have been ladled out of them to customers standing just where we do now. One even had a menu painted on the wall, not with prices but with pictures. Chickens, ducks, jugs of wine, a bowl, a ladle, a man slouching behind a counter, 2,000-year-old advertising. In Herculaneum they found carbonized nuts, figures, olives, a jar of garum still sealed. The label survived. It said the sauce was very good. They found skeletons in kitchens, burned bread still in the oven, bowls on tables, half-finished meals, the kind of things no one thinks to save, because no one expected the meal to be their last. Some stalls had graffiti, notes from customers, names scratched into stone. The Roman equivalent of Lucius was here, sometimes with commentary on the food, sometimes with something cruder. They found serving dishes, spatulas, charred frying pans. the tools of people who worked 14-hour days for the chance to burn their hands on something barely edible. And they found life, not of emperors or generals, but of cooks, vendors, hungry citizens standing in line. It's all frozen, not preserved in luxury, but in routine. And when you look at that blackened loaf, that burnt bowl of beans, you realise this wasn't a feast. It was just lunch, interrupted. So what does it all mean? The bread, the beans, the cheap wine, the burned pots, the scorched stalls buried in ash. It means that Romans, for all their empires and temples and oratory, were just people. Hungry, tired, busy, trying to stretch one coin into 3 meals, trying to find comfort in something hot and salty between the noise and the dust. Junk food shows you what people really cared about, not what they wrote down, but what they reached for, in the middle of the day, with grease on their hands and sweat on their foreheads. It tells you what they missed when they were away from home, what they saved up for, what they fed their children when there wasn't time to cook, what they handed to a stranger on a street corner in exchange for a few small coins and a moment of relief. It wasn't about nutrition or elegance or legacy. It was about survival seasoned with just enough pleasure to make life feel human again. And when you strip away the walls, the marble, the history books, you're left with something remarkably familiar. Not emperors, not soldiers, but a person crouched on a step, eating fried dough from a leaf, licking honey off their fingers, and thinking about absolutely nothing for just a few quiet minutes. Because sometimes that's all a person needs. A meal. A moment. Something small and hot and comforting in a world that rarely is. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. Not with an emperor, not with a speech, just with the soft sound of a frying pan, the warmth of honey on your fingers, and the knowledge that 2,000 years ago someone sat down with sore feet, a tired stomach, and a paper-thin coin, and found comfort in something small. They didn't write history, they just lived it, one bite at a time. If this kind of quiet, slow history helped you rest tonight, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly helps. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always comforting to know who else is drifting off to the same forgotten corners of the world. So now, breathe out, let the dust settle, let the oil cool, and let your body go soft and still. The stalls are closing, the fires are low, and the streets of Rome are quiet again. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.